impossibility and faith collide and give birth to a promise. And now she holds on to her promise. But what happens when that promise dies? What happens when you're at a place where you're excited in God now and someone spoke a powerful word in your life and now you see it coming to pass and it brings such an excitement in your life. You want to serve God more, but then life happens. And the boy was born and the boy was introduced to life. And he had to go through the things that we go through in life. And the Bible says that the boy grew ill and the boy passed away. And now the woman is looking at her child, her promise, her faith, all that she had to hold on to, of saying that this is what God promised me. This was the impossible. They said I was barren, but I'm looking at a child. And now all of a sudden that dies in her life. How difficult that must have been for her. How she must have had to deal with that, of going through her faith, how that must have rocked her with trying to serve God. But the Bible says that she did something interesting. She didn't even tell anybody that the child was dead. She summoned for the prophet to come back because he's the one who gave her the word. So he must have the source to bring him back to life, because he's the one who spoke the child into existence. So before telling anybody the child's dead or anything like that, she brings the boy to the bed where Elisha stayed, runs back, sends her servant, and says, "Bring me the prophet." The author explains the boy's death in an interesting way. Nowadays, when we're describing somebody's death, we would describe their death as saying they had no pulse or they had no breath. But the Hebrew author highlights the description of this death, saying that the signs of life that the boy didn't have was hearing nor speaking. The Bible says in a lot of different interpretations, it said the boy could not hear nor could he speak. And when we walk with Christ, Christ often describes our spiritual walk of living and dying with a spiritual enlightenment, being able to hear and speak. He says, faith cometh by what? By hearing, and hearing by the word. So the Hebrew author is saying that, listen, the boy's dead, and so many times in our spiritual walk, we wind up dead spiritually, because we come to a place of not believing in God because of what our situation looks like in the present. And so what happens is we develop an uncircumcised ear, right? You know how powerful communication is? Words are powerful. Words are life-changing. Just by a few words, wars were started. By speeches, wars were stopped. Words are so powerful. They can encourage, they can lift up somebody, or they can tear down somebody. But there's something even more powerful than words. It's hearing. When we were all growing up, we didn't come out the womb speaking. We had to develop a sense of listening so that our accents and our words come from what we hear, what we're surrounded with. So we weren't able to speak until we could first hear. And what happens is we walk around with uncircumcised ears. We don't have the ability to hear our Father. See, hearing and listening are two different things. Hearing gives you the ability to speak, but listening gives you the ability to communicate. You can talk with somebody and speak for hours, and there's no unity established. You can speak with somebody and have great conversation and all this stuff, and you guys talked about nothing because you didn't take the time to listen to the conversation. Therefore, you couldn't impart anything to the conversation. Therefore, effective communication could not be established. Communities are built starting from unity. That's why the word community is centered around the word unity. You can't establish a community unless you first unite together. You can't establish unity unless you first communicate. You can't establish communication unless you first listen. So listening gives birth to a community of kingdom believers when we're able to communicate. The problem is when we enter in a sphere, the problem is we have difficulty communicating. We have difficulty communicating because we don't know who we are in God. We don't know who we are in God, so when we speak, we don't speak life about ourselves. We speak life out of pride sometimes about ourselves, but we don't speak life out of humility, two different things. And it's only because we don't know who we are. Therefore, the thing that we're portraying to somebody else, we're misleading them. And so they get a wrong diagnosis of who we are because we cannot effectively communicate who we are. You know why? Because all our lives, we've surrounded ourselves with people who tell us who we are. We surround ourselves with people who speak to us and tell us what we can't do, who speak to us and tell us what we're limited by, who speak to us and tell us that we'll never amount to anything, who speak to us and say, you didn't graduate high school, so you can't do this, who speak to us and say, your pride will always be there and tear you down, who speak to us and say all these things that limit our success in moving forward. And so we have never developed the time that we step in the presence of our Father and acquire the skill to listen. Hearing is a physical ability, but listening is an acquired skill. And when we step in the presence of God and just wait and listen to our Father deposit in our lives, we walk away with something greater inside of us, with a greater identity in who we are. And so when we speak to people, we impact the community so much greater in a kingdom way, because now I know who I am, not by people, not by a thing or a job or a label of success, but I know who I am because my Father spoke it into my life. There's a huge difference between speaking and communicating, hearing and listening. And so we walk around with this uncircumcised ear with a difficulty communicating. And the woman is now faced with this situation and doesn't know what report to believe because she still has the dead promise. But yet that faith had to be true because it made the child come alive. And so what do you do when your faith meets adversity? And in this walk, so many of us get defeated, so many of us give up so easily because the faith that we have inside of us meets adversity. The faith that we have inside of us, life happens, and it crushes us inside, and the faith somewhere gets buried under everything that happens in our life. The faith somewhere disappears between the trials and the adversity and the situations. It gets buried under there. And what happens is we don't experience who God really is because it's through the adversity of faith, David. It's through the adversity of faith that we understand who God is in the promise. Because we chase after the promise all the time, walking in God. But what happens is when when the adversity goes against the faith, we find out who God is in the promise. Because what happened is we know God and we know what He can do. But then what happens is life hits